Hi, Misha here, and in the last episode we looked at some of the earlier light cruisers of the Japanese Navy. Really, most are the 5,500 ton hulls. And now it's time to kind of look at the others, the later ones for the most part. At first this might seem a little bit more of a diverse group, but actually there's a lot of connective tissue. But before we get into that, just to be a completionist, I really had to bring out Kumano again and talk about her because it was a quote-unquote light cruiser initially. Now, I've done a full video on the Magami class, so I'm not going to do it here, but these were first budgeted in 1931. Japan was constrained by the London Naval Treaty of 1930. They really couldn't build more heavy cruisers per limits, but they could still build light cruisers. And the way the London Naval Treaty defined the difference was basically the guns. Heavy cruisers had something like an 8-inch, and light cruisers would have 5, 6-inch guns. Either one had to be under 10,000 tons. So they designed a ship that was nominally 8,500 tons, although in practice it was just a hair under 11,000 tons, and then later would grow to 13,000. But it was armed with 15 5 turrets of 3, 6.1-inch guns, which was the absolute largest gun allowed on a light cruiser. And it was them being cheeky, trying to make a heavy cruiser or even a small battleship into a light cruiser, and they had issues, and these ships, especially later ones like Kumano, only stayed in the quote-unquote light cruiser formation for a very brief period of time in the 1938 period. And their 6.1-inch turrets would actually go to Yamato and Musashi, and actually another ship we have here, Oyodo. So they had plans, they knew what they were doing. But it was technically a light cruiser. And it benefited from research on a different light cruiser from the 1920s that's also served throughout World War II, Yubari. Kind of an interesting little experimental ship here that really influenced all the rest of these, and that's why they joined together rather nicely. So yeah, let's get into the later IJN light cruisers. Yubari was unique, the only ship in her class, and that's how it was always planned. This was to be an experimental ship, specifically a scout cruiser. It was to test new technologies, new manufacturing techniques, new ways of doing things. The idea, they wanted the firepower of something like a Sende, but they wanted it in as low a displacement hull as possible, and they wanted it as fast as possible. This experimental scout cruiser was first authorized in 1917, so during World War I, but funding was not allocated for it until 1921. It was designed to be around 3,000 tons, so a little bit bigger than a destroyer. In the end, like most Japanese ships, it was overweight at nearly 4,000 tons. Still lighter than the others by quite a bit, but there you have it. It's about 455 feet long, and would have a crew of between 300 and 350 depending on the mission and whatnot. It was pretty fast at about 35 knots, and it had a main armament of 6 5.5-inch guns. 4 would be in 2 twin mount turrets, and 2 more would be in single mounts, more or less midships. She would also have 4 torpedo tubes with a reload each. And she would have your typical anti-aircraft armament for the 20s, but they did try putting it on a raised platform, a pedestal, to see if that would help. They also went to different new styles of boilers. They went to a single funnel arrangement, which honestly had to be quickly modified in just a couple of years after she went into service because it wasn't flowing properly. But that's what experimental ships are for, right? She could also launch depth charges and mines, at least later in her career. And a lot of experimental manufacturing techniques were pioneered with her. For example, using alloys where possible, also using welding rather than riveting, and pretty much making the hull and the deck, the armor, all of these things really reduced weight. Unfortunately, it had other consequences too, which is kind of how the Mogami directly is led from the Yubari, but can't really blame her. Again, she was experimental. Her earliest service, she was just coming online in 1923 when the Great Kanto earthquake happened, so she was immediately pressed in to assist survivors. After that, she would putter around throughout the 1920s, testing out things, doing things, figuring out what didn't work and trying to fix it. She was put into the reserve fleet in 1933, and then in late 1935 she would go in for a refit or reconstruction to modernize her, fix some issues. This is right after the 4th Fleet incident as well. She would be back on station before the Second Sino-Japanese War. She would be assigned to patrol Japanese waters, and then once war was official, in 1937, she would be assigned first to transport Japanese that were in China, out of China, and then afterwards she would kind of get one of her first combat duties. She would be sent north to cover Japanese army landings. After that, she would be taken back for reserve and then refit again. And when World War II began, she was stationed near and out of Truk, and she was the flagship, the lead ship of a destroyer squadron. And she was the flagship for the naval forces during the Wake Island invasion in December. And she took part in several operations throughout 1942 as well. And she got her nose quite well bloodied in March of that year. She was repeatedly attacked over several days in mid-March, but she did make it back and had to go in for emergency refit and repair. She just got out in time to help rescue survivors of the sinking of the carrier Shoho in May, the first Japanese carrier to be lost. And from there she would go on to support other endeavors, including fighting in August in Savo Island, scoring a few hits on Allied ships, and then by the end of that year she would return to Japan for kind of rest and refit again, and she would keep getting more and more upgrades and updates. But as happened with so many Japanese cruisers, in April of 1944 she crossed paths with an American submarine. It fired 6 torpedoes at her and she nimbly evaded 4. Unfortunately, she did not evade 6. And since this is a relatively light hull, relatively small design, even if it's rather nimble, she wasn't long for this world at that point, and she went to the bottom. But keeping in mind that she was never even really meant to be a frontline military ship in that sense, she served better than expected, and is an interesting one-ship class, and a pretty just unusual design in general. Some of her experiments were good and used later on, others not so good and were hopefully dropped. But that did lead to our next classes. Well, have you ever wondered how the Japanese Navy trained new officers? Well, wonder no more. Meet the Katori class. These were training cruisers. 3 were built, 4 were planned, but the 4th one was scrapped. And these were desperately needed because they've been using old, very dated, armored cruisers for decades to train officers. Well, they first budgeted these in 1937 and then allocated more money in 39 for an additional one. And so these came off the slipways around 1940. Katori here is what the class is named for. It's interesting because it's not a typical design. Now, Yubari was still a military ship, if experimental. It was built with military standards, tactics, good and bad. The Katori were built like a commercial cruiser would be built. This meant it was wider and shorter than typical. It's still a relatively heavy design. It floats right around 6,000 tons, and this combined with its girth meant that it was actually a good handler at sea. It was pretty stable, which was good for training. It even had mixed engine types to give sailors practice. It had diesel as well as the standard oil burners. But it was slow. It could only get up to 18 knots maximum, which was the cruising speed for most of these other cruisers, but it didn't need it. The guns, primary armament, were 4 5.5-inch guns. And it had a little bit of everything else, again, kind of for training. It had 5-inch guns for anti-aircraft nominally, 13mm machine guns. Of course, it had 25mm guns and it started off with 4. It would have 30 by the end of things. It could also launch torpedoes, but interestingly, it used the older 21-inch torpedo, not the newer 24 or 24-inch long lance. Could also launch depth charges. Everything about it was kind of meant for training. Her standard crew on board would be about 600, but of these, a little over 300 would actually be crew, and a little under 300 would actually be trainees, midshipmen. Nevertheless, once war began, these were pressed into service. They were used as kind of command ships, office ships, and also flagships. Oh, Katori here kind of had the worst luck of her 3 sisters, though. She was bloodied early on in February of 1942 because of bombers from USS Enterprise. She had to go back to Japan for refit, and she was used as a training ship in home waters throughout 43. She was hanging out around Truk in February of 1944 when there was a big air attack and she was sunk. Kashi, her sister, had better luck. For one thing, she saw more frontline action. She covered more invasions and whatnot early on, although just, secondary roles. And she would be turned into an anti-submarine cruiser in 1944, when they didn't have the luxury of having training ships anymore, or the ability to waste fuel on them. And she would meet her end in January of 1945, much like other Japanese ships. And the luckiest of them all was Kashima. She would start off quite good. In December of 1941, she would actually be the flagship of the 4th Fleet based out of Truk. She would then be a part of several landings, invasions, and operations in 1942. And in 1943, she would be transferred to a training division in home waters. Then at the end of the year and into the next year, she would be in dry dock for update. And then throughout 1944, she would be used as a transport. Not a fast one, but a transport. And then late in 44, she too would be made into an anti-submarine cruiser and did pretty much nothing for the rest of the year, and amazingly was not bombed out of existence. In fact, she was very much in working order in August of 1945. And like the light carrier Hosho, that fall, she was used to bring Japanese citizens back home. These were typically soldiers that had been serving overseas. They were, quote-unquote, demilitarized and then loaded on board and sent home. So she served her country after the war, and honestly more of a role that she was originally intended for. After that duty, she was mothballed and then sold for scrap, cut up in 1947. So one of these survived the war. But again, these weren't meant to be combat ships. They had guns, but the guns were originally just there to help, practice. Now later, yeah, they were there because every Japanese ship got a bunch of guns because it was the only prayer they had of surviving. Interesting cruiser. Again, just a very different hull design. Shorter than the Yubari. It's about 420, 430 feet, but much wider. Only 2 shafts, though. She did have a ability to launch a float plane. Kind of neat. Well, let's move on to our last couple of candidates. Agano. The last kind of major cruiser project, at least light cruiser project, of Japan. And if this looks similar to Oyodo here, there's a good reason for that we'll get to. But firstly, this. The Aganos were designed after Japan left the London Naval Treaty. Work started in 1937, and towards the end of the year they had a design ready to go and approval to construct them. What they didn't have were free dockyards, free shipyards to build them. So the 4 actually weren't ordered until 1939. Japan was a busy place in the military at that time, and it just wasn't a huge priority. This is a very different cruiser from what we had before. We're finally getting away from the 5.5 ton design. This is nominally a 6,500 ton hull, 7,000 kind of just standard, and up to 7,500 when fully ladened up. She is pretty big, at about 570 feet long, and she has a crew of over 700, give or take. That said, she's actually quite fast at 35 knots and quite agile. And she's not overweight and she's not top heavy. So she had quite decent seakeeping. She didn't fall victim to some of the earlier flaws because they weren't trying to save weight with her, like on the Magamis. But whereas the Magamis had originally 15 6.1-inch guns, and later would go up to 8-inch guns, the Agano here would have 6-inch guns, so the slightly older gun, and 3 twin turrets, 2 forward, 1 rear. And she would have your typical anti-aircraft arrangements, a little heavier than early war ones, and of course, as we know now, they just kept sticking on 25mm guns even if they weren't effective. Yeah, she was fast and agile, quite stable, but she was kind of lightly gunned, and her armor wasn't superb. On the one hand, she didn't have a good torpedo broadside. She had 2 quad launchers and carried anywhere from 16 up to 24 torpedoes on board for reloads, and these were the new, of course, long lance style. And for submarine hunting, she had a hydrophone system and an early sonar. She also carried 2 float planes for reconnaissance. So all in all, was not a bad quality ship. To my mind, the lighter main gun armament's kind of the bigger deal, but so it goes. The original idea behind the Agano class was to replace the older ships like the Tenryus, the Kumas, and the Nagaras. So kind of getting away from the older cruisers. That meant these would be used to kind of support, lead destroyer squadrons and submarine squadrons. So they were hoping to build 13 of these between 1939 and 1945 to do just that, because it's the number of squadrons the Japanese Navy had: 6 destroyer and 7 submarine. But like I said, their construction was delayed. Really didn't get underway until 1940, and Agano here is the first to be ready, and she was not commissioned until Halloween 1942. Yeah, you start to see a problem with this. This is already not the best time to be joining the Japanese Navy. Maybe leaving it, not joining it. Nevertheless, in 1943, she took part in various campaigns, for example, the Solomon Islands. Did this and that. But in November of that year, she was at Rabaul, the port, and there was a rather major air attack, and she was damaged pretty severely by a torpedo hit from an aircraft, and she was ordered to head back to Japan on November 11th. But before she could make it, on February 16th, a U.S. submarine spotted her and torpedoed her north of Truk. So, yeah, she was in service for less than a year and a half, and at least a few months at that time, she was pretty much not operational. So, yeah. Unfortunately, the cruisers really just came too late to matter. The next in class, Nashiro, joined the fleet even later, at the end of June 1943. She would be used some in the Solomons, and she too would be damaged in November during the raid on Rabaul, but she would successfully make it back to port and get repaired, and she would be part of the force during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 44. She would again survive this, and again would be there at Leyte Gulf, and she would survive the first day, the 25th, but as she was moving away on the 26th, planes from the USS Wasp found her and helped her on her way down. The next to join was Yahagio, or Nahagi, there we go, Nahagi. She would come in just a day or two before the end of 1943. So she missed the whole Rabaul thing. She too would be at the Philippine Sea, survived. She would be at Leyte Gulf, and actually would survive. So she made it back. 1945, she's puttering around. And then after the Allies invade Okinawa, she is ordered to go along with the battleship Yamato and basically make one giant futile suicide gesture. So on April 7th, Allied aircraft decide to help her along. She's hit by no fewer than a dozen bombs and over half a dozen torpedoes. That's going to do it. Like I said, the armor on these was not the best in the world to begin with, and yeah. So she was in service for about a year and a half. A little better than some, I suppose. But yeah, these ships are having pretty short careers because they came so late. In fact, even when they had them, Japan really couldn't operate them. Speaking of, the fourth and last member of the Agano class had a very similar fate to the one in the Katori class. Sakawa would actually be completed, although at this point you kind of have to wonder why. She was done on the last day of November 1944. Great. And did nothing because they did not have enough oil to even get her to move. As a result, she was in absolutely pristine condition when Japan surrendered and the Allies came in, and not wanting to waste a brand new ship with Cosmo lines still everywhere, they immediately put her into service, like the Kashima, transporting Japanese troops and citizens back home from August through October of 1945. And of course, waste not, want not. You got 'em. Use it. The U.S. decided to give her a proper Viking-style send-off by nuking the shit out of her in 1946 during an atom bomb test off Bikini Atoll. So that's a thing. One of the Aganos met its end via nuclear weapon. So yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, in November, why are you even finishing ships? It's pointless. But that leaves us with one. Oyodo. Here's Yubari and Agano together. You can, if I can have anything on camera, do what I can. You can tell how the hull from Yubari has been kind of modified and upscaled for Agano. It has the same, basic sweep and kind of clean lines and bow shape. And as I said, originally they were going to have 13 Aganos, 6 for destroyer squads and 7 for submarines. By 1939, they realized that the Agano wasn't really ideal, and they would need a different ship for the subs. Hence, Oyodo. Now, this is definitely a modified Agano hull, but it's larger. It's 630 feet long, and when this thing is light, it displaces well over 8,000 tons, and when it's heavy, 11,000. So it's getting very close to the Magamis. Has a crew of about, well, it depends. Anywhere from 750 to 850, depending on what it's doing. Yet it has a decent top speed of 35 knots. And it has two triple turrets in the front with the 6.1 inch guns, so 6.1 inch guns. Plus it has 8 3.9 inch dual purpose guns and 18 25mm guns. It doesn't have any torpedoes. Instead, that space and weight is used for a small flight deck in the back and a hangar. The plans called for the hangar to store up to 4 reconnaissance planes. They were going to have a brand new model, but instead they ended up using the E-13. So you could have 4 in the hangar, and then 2 more could be kept on the deck. And it originally had a heavy-duty, a larger, more capable catapult. It also had expanded communications equipment, because the idea was this would coordinate a submarine squadron. The way the Japanese operated their squadrons, they were kind of like the Wolfpack notion, but they were more long-ranged and a little bit more spread out. So you'd have sub-squads operating quite a distance, and keeping in mind we're in the Pacific, not the Atlantic. This makes sense. And a ship like this was to be the brains, the central hub. So why the planes? Well, the idea was it could use its reconnaissance planes to scout ahead, find enemy targets and direct the subs in, or keep tabs on enemy targets while the subs homed in on them. Just, command and control. So it was a command ship. 2 were ordered in 1939, although, like I said, they ultimately wanted to get 7. And Oyodo was laid down and construction began. But they had the same problem that they had with Agano, getting space. This had to wait for a bit to get started, and her sister ship was officially suspended in November of 1941 because they just couldn't find a place to build her. And then her construction was canceled in August of 42 after the Battle of Midway. It is an interesting model and an interesting ship because it's just so very different, and it's definitely a very large cruiser type with some very neat features. Well, while her sister was canceled, Oyodo was launched and finally commissioned at the end of February 1943. She would pop off and finish some final fitting out in March and April. One of the last things she got was a radar, and she was ready for service, by which time the Japanese Navy said, we don't know what to do with her, because the concept of a command ship for a submarine squadron was no longer valid because of Allied advancements in radar, reconnaissance aircraft, their own submarines, and the fact that by mid-1943, they were very much fighting a defensive war. Well, Yamamoto warned him. So, what to do with this rather large and rather expensive cruiser? A bit oddly, the Eagle Moss collection has pretty much all the ships except no Japanese subs. The only one they have is the very interesting I-400, but definitely not a standard sub. But they do have a German U-boat, Type 7, so I put it next to the Oyodo just for scale comparison. Why not? Thought it was fun. So yeah, it's ready to go by April, and they don't know what to do with it. Finally, they decide, hey, we'll just use it as a light cruiser and transport, armored transport. So they load her up with troops, supplies, and they send her off in July to truck. She makes this delivery, and she kind of hangs around the area for the rest of 1943. She will sortie out looking for the Allied fleet, not finding them. She will also be given intelligence about where Allied attacks might happen and goes there to try to defend or catch them off guard, unsuccessfully. So it's pretty boring, honestly. So just hanging around truck. On New Year's Day, January 1st, 1944, she is spotted by Allied Air Patrol and gets a little damage, nothing too bad, but she does need to go back to Yokosuka, Japan for repairs. While she's there, after she gets patched up, they load her up with supplies and torpedoes and whatnot for the garrison on Saipan, and despite a couple of near misses, she makes the delivery towards the end of February, and then she goes back in the dock because they kind of figured out what to do with her. Beginning in March and ending at the end of March 1944, she is refit into a command ship, which is actually a brilliant idea for Oyodo because she has all this space, the hangar. She has very good communications equipment. She does have 6.1 inch guns, better air defense than others. Oh, and the fact that by March, the Japanese Navy's options for command ships are getting fewer and fewer, literally by the day. So she goes in, they convert her hangar into staff offices and living quarters. They give her 2 new surface search radars. They update and give her more 25mm guns. I think she's nearly at 50 now. You know, they didn't have the resources to make Arisaka rifles, at least not with, wooden butt plates and all that. Yet somehow those 25mm guns, they had plenty of those. Anyway, I digress. They also take off her heavy-duty catapult because the float plane that it was built for was never going to be made. So they just put a standard catapult to save weight and deck space. And a few little things. And at the beginning of May 1944, the Grand Admiral of what is left of the combined fleet hoists his flag on board Oyodo. Oh, one other thing, her crew was now over 900 with the Admiral and his staff on board. This was pretty much his floating command post that summer, but then in June you had the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the obliteration of the Navy's remaining air cover, and then the submarine attacks are really on the rise beginning in August. Therefore, at the end of September, the Admiral and his staff decide, you know what, being on a floating target may not be the best thing. So he left and went into an underground bunker on land. Far cry from a cruiser. So with the Admiral gone, the Oyodo is free again to join the main mobile fleet. So in early October, she gets one more round of updates. She gets yet more radar equipment. She has a handful more 25mm guns installed. Now, because her original hangar is now crew quarters, she can only carry 2 E-13 reconnaissance planes. She's assigned back to the mobile main fleet, and then very quickly she's mustered into going down to defend the Philippines. On her way there, she encounters a grumpy American submarine who fires 6 torpedoes at her. And for once, all miss or fail to detonate, and so she gets away scot-free. She joins the battle at Leyte Gulf, and she does get damaged. She gets a couple of near misses and a direct hit, but what she'd really been used there for was part of the Northern Decoy Force, where they sent a bunch of empty or mostly empty carriers north to try to draw the Americans away. Interestingly, Oyodo had the only reconnaissance planes in that force, so she really had an active duty. She was doing scouting patrols, anti-sub patrols, looking out. Well, her pilots were. Anyway, she does beat a retreat and makes it out. Gets to a friendly port. And she actually docks at Singapore for repairs. And while at Singapore, she takes on board a lot of needed supplies and joins a major convoy going back to Japan that's bringing Japanese nationals back that had been working on the oil fields. They no longer had jobs. And oil, of course, aviation fuel, mercury, rubber, zinc, other alloys that Japan was very low on. They were trying to do rockets and stuff, So yeah, she leaves Singapore on the 10th of February in a major convoy, taking very vital supplies back to Kura, Japan. And between that time and when she gets there, on February 20th, 23 Allied submarines, both British and American, do their damnedest to sink her and her sister ships in the convoy. And I don't know what luck they were running, but they made it. They delivered their cargo. The problem is now there's really not enough fuel or any reason. The waters are way too hostile to send her back out. So she joins the training division at Kura. But then she's there when the Allies begin attacking it on March 19th. She is very severely damaged. She was going to sink, but they were able to kind of pull her and beach her. And then they were able to make temporary repairs, float her, and then tow her to the dockyard. And throughout April, they patched her up. By the beginning of May, she was, if not ship-shape, at least ship-shaped again, and could float. And does really nothing, because what can she do? And, of course, she's there again on July 24th when there's another huge, major raid at this naval port because they're ready just to wipe out the Japanese Navy. They're done with it. They're over. The Yamato's gone now. Let's just end this crap. Germany's gone. Why are you still fighting? So she is majorly damaged on the 24th, but somehow still sort of floating, at least in a weird way. And then on the 28th, there's yet another raid, and she's hit again, and capsizes, and sinks, taking most of her crew with her, because she still had crew on board. So her run ended just a couple of weeks before the surrender and official and all that of the war. So she almost survived the war. One thing I will say, all the hits she took, and how she shrugged so many of them off, she seems to have had either better luck or better armor or just a better plan than the Aganos. Just an observation. And yeah, this kind of ends the story of the last cruiser model. Much like with Yubari, this was a one-ship class, even though there was supposed to be more at one time. And a very interesting ship, I think. Interesting model. I like models that are aircraft carriers. And she's one of the few that really did use her aircraft. A lot of them had them and never really did, or even had aircraft on board. She never had her full complement of 6. I think the most she ever had was 3 on board, maybe 4. And again, she never had the aircraft she was intended to have. But there you have it, guys. Like I said at the beginning, they use their cruisers for reconnaissance. So we plowed through all the light cruisers. I guess next we'll have to get to destroyers, huh? Or maybe I'll take a break and do British ships. Anyway, I appreciate you staying with me. Hope you had fun. I did this on a Saturday just to kind of relax. It's been a long week. I find it relaxing, and I love these little models. They're the perfect scale. You know, I like the 1/700 from like Forces of Valor. It's neat, but it's so big you can only fit them on certain shelves, and only maybe 6. These are small enough you can put 40 on a shelf. And they're just big enough that they're not terribly fragile, and they have some good weight to them. And they seem pretty well built, quite durable. This one here, Oyodo, actually took me a bit to get. I did order it from Aikens. They had it on their site, but they called me very apologetic, saying their system was messed up and they actually didn't have any. So, oh well. But then I found one that just popped up a day or two later on eBay, and it was actually a little bit cheaper than what Aikens had been asking, so that's alright. For whatever reason, this Oyodo is not all that common in the US. The other cruisers are, but I don't know. It was made towards the very end of the collection, so that might have something to do with it. Well, guys, I'm going to call it a day. I appreciate it greatly, and I will catch you very soon next time.